Hello, Internet, specifically music nerds on the Internet. I'm here to ramble about the history of the album format. I'm making this little project because I feel that the album format has changed a lot since it was originally conceived, especially with the advent of the Internet, and I just feel like talking about it. For music listeners, we've really come to expand our expectations of what an album can really be in terms of theme, length, intent, packaging, really anything and everything regarding what we can mentally prepare ourselves to get out of an album before we listen to it. The same thing can be said about the artistic side as well, except on that front, you've got new ideas in terms of the actual releasing and marketing of an album. I'm going to loosely walk through the history of the album format and kind of, by extension, the history of popular music in general. I'll hone in on plenty of examples along the way of albums that I'm personally familiar with, and specifically ones that I think are good examples of the beginning of different trends in history. I'm going to mostly go in chronological order, but I'm also going to condense certain topics together, basically like chapters. I think it's more fitting to dedicate certain sections of this project to the very different branches of how the album has evolved over the years. I'm by no means an expert in music or music history or really anything. I just listen to a lot of music and feel like talking about it. And even then, there's plenty of music that I still haven't listened to. There's plenty of music that I've never even heard of. So please don't roast me. So let's get started. Before we can ask how the album has evolved, we have to ask how it even started. Why is this specific medium the most popular way that music has been released over the past 60 years? To answer that question, I think you kind of have to get to the root of popular music in general, and the idea that, popular music is just music that is being widely distributed and widely consumed. The album just happens to be the most popular way to get music out to people. I spent so much time trying to decide where to really start this whole history lesson because it's basically impossible to kind of delineate the beginning of popular music or the first album. Did Beethoven get in front of his piano and decide, I'm going to write an album? No, that didn't exist at the time. Nonetheless, he composed music, and outside entities and publishers tried to release his music to as wide of an audience as possible in the form of sheet music, concerts, really anything that can make money. In many ways, that's basically what the music industry today is. The record player was invented in 1877, but the vinyl record, or long play record, LP record for short, wasn't invented until 1948. Specifically, I'm talking about the 33 LP, as in 33 and a third revolutions per minute, which allows you to store 44 minutes of music on a record, 22 minutes per side. Prior to 1948, the only available format for releasing music commercially was the 78 RPM record, which only allowed you to fit 5 minutes of music per side. So for a while, singles were the only way that you could release your music because there was just no way to put more music onto a physical medium. The early 20s is when the radio started playing music, and the late 20s is actually when movies started having sound in them. The real shot in the arm that kickstarted the music industry that we know today was television in the 50s and 60s. Generally speaking, if you're looking for the start of popular music, you're probably going to go to the 1950s. I mean, good luck even finding music that's older than 1950 on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever. Some of the earliest iconography of popular music comes from the 50s in the form of variety shows airing live performances of Chuck Berry doing the duck walk in front of 40 couples doing these crazy swing dances. Now, if you think of artists from this era, like Chuck Berry or like Elvis, I would put money on the fact that you might not even be able to name an album by either of them. That's because even though the LP record format was around at the time, it really hadn't caught on yet as a prevailing trend. So the success of a lot of the rock and roll icons that we know was driven by their singles. Singles being standalone tracks that an artist would write or record, specifically with the goal of having a wide appeal or being easy to market. Of course, a 3-minute single is a lot easier for someone to listen to in one sitting than an entire album. It's also a lot more versatile in terms of marketing, whether that be in the form of an advertisement or in a music video. Even when a lot of these artists started dropping albums, for example, if you look at Chuck Berry's debut 1957 album, After School Session, There's 12 tracks on that album, but 10 of them were already singles that had been released to the public. So if you wanted to listen to all the singles in one place, you could get the album, but it's just a compilation of the singles that you already know. It's not a new artistic expression or anything like that. He didn't write the album. He just wrote a bunch of singles and then lumped them together to make an album. Even if you go further back in time than this, a lot of the very first albums that were ever pressed were actually just recordings of like orchestras playing old classical music. So the long play record was being utilized, but it wasn't really being utilized to create albums as we understand them today. But basically all the ingredients to make albums are present by the late 50s. You have artists that are trying to make a livelihood off of their music. You have audiences that want to spend money on music. You have a physical vinyl disc that can fit 44 minutes of music on it. There just aren't a lot of artists saying, okay, I'm going to write an album. I'm going to write individual songs, but I'm going to assemble and organize them in such a way that creates a holistic listening experience that I want someone to consume in one sitting. But there are some artists saying this. So at this point in history, you can really view the album as kind of an up-and-coming trend, and the single is still kind of the primary market for the music industry. How trends form in music, or really anything, is basically impossible to trace exactly, but there are a few artists that I want to highlight as being early adopters of the album and kind of paving the way for the album mindset that we know today. The artist that comes first in history is actually pop singer Frank Sinatra. Some people might even say that he invented the album. His debut album, The Voice of Frank Sinatra, came out in 1946, which by itself, that's pretty crazy. That's like a 75-year-old album. I mean, listening to that is like experiencing history firsthand almost. Also, the 33 LP record wouldn't even be invented until 2 years later. So the album was initially released as a set of 4 separate 78 RPM records, totaling 8 songs. 9 years later, he actually released his 9th studio album, In the Wee Small Hours, which a lot of people reference as being the first concept album ever. That's a topic that we will touch on shortly. The big difference with Frank Sinatra and the artists that I had previously been mentioning, like Chuck Berry, Elvis, those kind of guys, is that Frank Sinatra was releasing an album with new music, newly recorded music that hadn't been aired on the radio or released as a single. This plays into the anticipation factor that we are familiar with when an album comes out today. Frank is asking listeners to go out and buy his album, even though they don't know if they're going to like it or not. They don't know any of the songs that are on it. And then when you actually get the album, you can't just skip to the track that you like because you don't know any of the songs yet. You just have to sit there and play the album and listen to the whole thing from front to back. While I do want to pay respect to Frank Sinatra for truly being a trailblazer in utilizing the longer album format to really build out his music catalog, I think it's also important to highlight the fact that he didn't actually write any of his own music. Maybe I'm being a bit of a stickler here, but he exclusively recorded and released music that was either originally written by someone else or was an old jazz standard or show tune, or he even had people that wrote music for him. So when you listen to a Frank Sinatra album, you're technically not getting an entirely original piece of work. While that might sound kind of strange, it's actually kind of the norm for a lot of artists around this era in time, even all the way up to like the late 60s. I mean, Elvis is also famously known to have never written any of his songs. A band that I personally love, Led Zeppelin, comes under fire all the time for basically straight up stealing melodies and ideas from older blues musicians and then not even crediting them. And by no means am I bringing this up, at least in the context of this essay, to like discredit or disrespect these artists. It was just a different time period back then. Especially in the blues music scene, it was very common for artists to borrow ideas, melodies, lyrics from each other. It was really around the late 60s that the music industry and music culture at large in general started to more strictly characterize this as plagiarism. And in my opinion, that's probably for the better. You know, the music industry has moved on to be a little bit more creative and original. So again, back to Frank Sinatra. He was a pioneer in the way that he viewed the album. You know, he thought of it as a very important way to be able to deliver music to his audience. That in itself was instrumental in changing the way that music listeners view an album. From being just a collection of random songs that have nothing to do with each other, to being a cohesive, almost narrative piece of work with songs that segue into each other, that tie together, that touch on the same themes or topics. Nobody else was really carrying the torch like this at the time. But personally, I just think it's kind of a hard to ignore asterisk that he didn't write the music. I guess he was more so curating songs for someone to listen to and putting his lovely voice onto record for us to enjoy. There's also a specific genre and group of artists that I want to highlight. A bit of a cultural movement that was brewing in the 50s that placed a lot of emphasis on the album format, and that's the jazz scene. Of course, there's the legendary trumpeter Miles Davis, a hugely influential artist in his own right, but also an early adopter of the album format. And not just him, but plenty of his jazz contemporaries as well. Art Blakey, John Coltrane, Dave Brubeck, the list kind of goes on forever. Jazz music in the 50s, and even really today still, just kind of finds itself more naturally in long-form songwriting and uninhibited jam sessions. Just look at some of the classic jazz albums of the 50s. You have Kind of Blue by Miles Davis, released in 1959. The album is like 45 minutes, but it's only 5 distinct songs. Blue Train by John Coltrane in 1957, 43 minutes and 5 songs. Moanin' by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, 40 minutes and 6 songs in 1959. I mean, these guys basically did not give a fuck about writing singles, catchy, short songs, so it only makes sense for them to want to utilize the album and its longer runtime to release music. If I'm going to be consistent, the same complaint, if you will, that I kind of lodged about Frank Sinatra is kind of true for a lot of the jazz musicians that I mentioned as well, but to a significantly lesser extent, I would say. Even if you have instances of a jazz artist re-recording a song that had already been written by someone else, they were really only taking a couple of motifs from the original song, such as a main melody or maybe a main hook that gets repeated a couple of times. Most of the time, there's no lyrics that you can copy either. And then in the recording sessions, the new artist is basically just doing a bunch of improvisation right in the studio. That is totally original. I know I'm kind of being a stickler about this whole point of writing your own music, but I kind of do it to highlight the evolution of the album format and popular music in general. At the end of the day, music for the most part is a for-profit industry, but there's something awesome about seeing how as the recording process and the process of releasing music to a wide audience becomes easier and more accessible throughout history, you have more and more people just writing music for the sake of music or for the sake of expressing yourself. Throughout all of this, the album has kind of remained as the gold standard for making a big artistic musical statement. By the early 60s, there's already a handful of albums that we today look back on as classics. Most of them are jazz albums or vocal jazz albums, but you even have Bob Dylan, the godfather of folk himself, releasing his debut and sophomore albums in 1962 and 1963. Everything that has happened up to this point in history has laid the groundwork for the album format to take over. I mean, albums already exist at this point. It's no longer an up-and-coming trend exactly, but when does a trend stop being an underground movement and start having mainstream viability? For that to happen, you need a mainstream artist to kind of hop on the bandwagon. Well, in 1963, 4 gentlemen from Liverpool, England did just that and released their debut album, Please Please Me. Those 4 gentlemen were known as the Beatles. Of course, the impact of the Beatles, basically on the history of the world, can't really be overstated. It's not exactly what I'm here to talk about, although this essay is going to have a lot more Beatles worship than I originally planned. For right now, we can highlight the impact that their debut album had. Again, the framework for what we already understand as an album exists by this point, and Please Please Me is no dramatic departure from that framework. The album is a pretty straightforward pop rock effort. It's composed of 14 different songs and runs at about 32 minutes. Only a couple of the songs and their B-sides were released before the entire album was released. This is a marketing blueprint that's still followed today. Give your audience a small appetizer ahead of time so that they can know what to expect and can get excited for the main course when it arrives. Most of the songs on this album were written by the duo of Paul McCartney and John Lennon, although there are still more than a handful of songs that are covers. It only took the Beatles 2 more tries to release an entirely original album in 1964, their 3rd album titled A Hard Day's Night. So when the Beatles, who are quite literally the most copied band of all time, release an album and ask people to buy their album, that's basically when the floodgates open. From this point on, everyone recognizes the album as the main moneymaker in the music industry. You can't just build your entire career on singles anymore because audiences want an album. They expect artists to release an album. They're spending their money on albums. And so begins the album era. Before we go any further, I want to take a little bit of time to highlight the actual vinyl record, like the physical medium itself. because this is basically synonymous with the word album for a very long time. Of course, before the advent of CDs and digital streaming. There are some aspects of the vinyl record that I want to highlight because it's going to be the predominant format on which music is released over the next couple of decades that I cover. The fundamental characteristics of vinyl are basically implied for all of the albums that I've mentioned up to this point, and that I will continue to mention up until the point that CDs are invented. Some of the physical limitations of listening to vinyl have probably never even dawned on a lot of younger music listeners. Let's start with the record player. It's a big, bulky machine that plays your records for you. It's so big and so bulky that if you got one, you probably just leave it in one specific room in your house. The room where you sit down and listen to your records. Just by the nature of it being a physical medium, it demands your attention. You can't just listen to it on your way to work or put it in your pocket. You need to take out your record, put it on the turntable, and listen to it and probably not do anything else. You're just there to listen to music. It's honestly a pretty inconvenient way to listen to music. In today's age, you can listen to music anywhere. You can take your phone, download an album, and go to the top of Mount Everest and listen to it if you want. Don't get me wrong, the widespread availability of music today is certainly an amazing thing. But with that territory kind of comes a certain amount of convenience, so much so that it has basically destroyed our attention span when it comes to music. Today, you can put on Spotify and listen to an endless stream of songs and albums while you clean your house or cook your dinner or whatever. But a record player demands more attention than that. For one, you have to physically get up and put your record on the record player and drop the stylus on it. And then when the album is halfway over, you have to get up again, take the stylus off, flip your record over, put the stylus back on, and listen to the second half. When the album ends, there isn't any autoplay or proprietary algorithm that decides what to play for you next. You just have to put on a different record. I think all of these seemingly minor qualities add up to create a more attentive music listening experience. In the age of digital streaming, it takes a bit more self-motivation to fully focus on the music that you're listening to in the moment. Another important aspect of records is that they have an A-side and a B-side, a front and a back. There's an intended flow to the album's track listing. You have to listen to these songs first and then listen to these songs after them. You can't just put your record player on shuffle. You have to listen to the album in the order that the artist intended. The idea of A-sides and B-sides is actually a lot more notable when we're talking about singles. This terminology has basically been lost to the digital streaming age. I mean, even CDs don't have a front and a back. The word single would make you think that an artist is just releasing one song. But if you're releasing the song on a record, then that record is going to have a front and a backside. So artists would have to put a second song onto their single release. And historically speaking, the B-side would be a less notable track than the single. I mean, even by definition, it's basically like a secondary track or a bonus track. A lot of the time, you might have instances of artists using a particular song for a B-side of a single, and then that song would just never show up again in the artist's discography, not in an album or anywhere else. So it was kind of an additional way to encourage listeners to buy singles, to get, that extra song that you're not going to listen to anywhere else. So these qualities of the physical record, keep in mind that they're kind of fundamentally influencing music culture in general and how artists are releasing music for several decades. And as a quick footnote, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention the EP. So the single is one song and its B-side. An album is several songs also split onto an A and B side. Specifically on vinyl, you could refer to an album as an LP record or a long play record. There actually exists one more popular format for releasing your music, and that is the EP or the extended play. You can basically think of an EP as a mini album. In physical record form, it holds more music than a single, but less music than an album. Like the album and single formats, the EP format has not gone anywhere. Artists still release EPs to this day. The EP format has just never been as popular or widely discussed as albums or singles. Singles are short and catchy. Albums are long enough to be fulfilling music listening experiences, and I think EPs just kind of find themselves in the middle of no man's land in between these two formats, not really scratching the itch that either of those two other formats scratch. And that's not to say that there aren't incredible EPs that exist. There certainly are. I guess the connotation of an EP is that it's less grand than an album. A lot of the times, though, it can be an opportunity for artists to kind of dip their toes in different waters when it comes to experimenting with new ideas or sounds. It can also be an opportunity for two different artists to collaborate together in a context that's a little bit less demanding than a full-on album.
Also,
once we've moved past the physical limitations of records, there's been plenty of instances of artists releasing pretty lengthy EPs that can climb past the 30-minute mark. At that point, if it's long enough to be considered an album, then shouldn't we just think of it as an album? Is the fact that the artist is calling it an EP Instead of an album supposed to make me, the listener, view it under a different lens, not the same lens that I view other albums under. Back to the physical limitation side as well, the 44-minute runtime of albums is really just an artifact of, again, the LP record, which has not held artists back for at least a few decades. Because of this, there's plenty of instances, especially today, of artists releasing albums that don't even cross the 30-minute mark. At what point is a collection of music too short to be fairly considered an album and needs to be demoted to the EP status? I don't know the answer to any of these questions, but ultimately, artists can label their music whatever they want. I guess most of the time, EPs are just detours in an artist's greater musical trajectory, or they serve as stepping stones that eventually lead to full album releases anyway. So we're in the mid-60s. Album sales have actually just overtaken single sales, which basically means that albums are now the officially prevalent way for musicians to release music and for audiences to consume music. Rock music of the time, or what we in modern day more specifically refer to as classic rock, is the most popular genre of music for basically the entire generation. So essentially, all of the trendsetters in music are going to be coming from this sphere for a while. Just a fair disclaimer in case you start wondering why I'm talking about so many different classic rock artists and albums. To jump back a bit, I previously mentioned that some of the earliest albums that were ever released were actually just recordings of orchestras performing classical music that had been composed by artists that lived far before the creation of music recording technology. Because those original composers were not constrained to any physical medium on which they had to record their music, there was no need for them to make sure that their compositions went under the 50-minute mark. This meant that recording an entire classical or operatic piece often meant that there was too much music to fit onto just one record. So those releases were sometimes split into 2 or more records. Before LP records became the norm, they were pretty costly to make and sell, so double albums and multi-record releases were largely limited to classical music or live jazz recordings. However, as the record eventually became the norm for the music industry, the cost to create and distribute records started to come down. Around this time, artists started to realize, hey, I have a lot of music to write and release, and I have a lot to say, and I can't fit it all into one album. But I'm going to release my music anyways. I'm going to have to release it onto 2 albums. Double the albums. The double album. Yes, the double album. It's as straightforward as it sounds. You go to the record store, you buy a double album, you take it home. Lo and behold, you have 2 separate records that you have to listen to. The idea is so simple and almost mundane that it might not seem like a big deal, but I think it is. I think it's a very meaningful evolution of both musical expression and music listening culture. From the artist side, you obviously have a lot more space to work with. There is room to explore a wider variety of topics, or perhaps to delve into one particular topic with greater intricacy. From the music listener side, it's really kind of a test of your patience. Are you willing to digest 2 albums worth of material and come to a conclusion about your music listening experience with this specific piece of work? Thankfully, in the 60s and the 70s, the answer from the music market was a resounding yes. Some of the most beloved albums from this period in time also happen to be double albums, such as the White Album by the Beatles in 1968. Electric Ladyland by Jimi Hendrix, also in 1968. Bitches Brew by Miles Davis in 1970. All of these albums performed pretty well on the charts when they debuted, were lauded by critics of their time, and nowadays are heralded by internet freaks like myself as classics. The most commonly referenced first double album ever released in popular music is actually Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde, released in 1966. It clocks in at about 1 hour and 13 minutes. A fun little quirk about having a double album is that you have 4 different sides: A, B, C, and D side. With Blonde on Blonde, the D side of the album is actually just one song by itself, titled Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, and it clocks in at 11 minutes and 23 seconds. So the entire second half of the second record of Blonde on Blonde is just one long song. This is a great example of how that additional space provided by having 2 full records to work with allows artists to kind of experiment with ideas not only in theme, but also in composition and length. I think it's a testament to the open-mindedness and curiosity of music listeners at the time that only a few years after the album format broke onto the scene, they were already willing and able to consume albums that were twice as long. Music listeners were opened to being challenged and tested by the music they were listening to. So yeah, the double album, it's a thing. I mean, there's also triple albums, it doesn't stop there, although I think those are significantly less popular and demand a little bit too much attention for most people. Although there is that newer Sextuple album by The Caretaker, Everywhere at the End of Time. It's apparently a concept album whose intent is to make the listener feel like they're getting dementia. I haven't listened to it yet, but the internet can't seem to get enough of it. Also, there are instances of sister albums or companion albums, basically when an artist has two different albums that were released separately, but they have enough connective tissue that they could have been released together at the same time as a double album. A great example is Queen's pair of albums, A Night at the Opera in 1975 and A Day at the Races in 1976. Both albums taking their names from Marx Brothers films and both sharing similar packaging and musical themes. Both albums seem to have an operatic, grandiose, almost whimsical air about them. Another very popular, although maybe not as universally loved, example comes from Metallica in the form of their 1996 album Load and then their 1997 follow-up Reload. I guess these examples are just watered-down ways of releasing a double album. But they still show that the artist has a bigger picture in mind. They're not just writing music in a vacuum, they're trying to connect their different projects together in a meaningful way, and that's always a worthwhile effort. Allow me to go on another tangent and talk about album art or cover art. Now, obviously, album art has existed just as long as the album has, and I could have just as easily thrown this topic into the section where I was talking about the physical nature of records, but I think it merits its own dedicated discussion. Album art plays a huge integral role in how you market your album, even more so before the age of digital streaming. In the past, the only way to buy music was to go to the record store. And before you go, you probably already have an idea of what you want to buy based on the artists that you already like, or maybe music that you had heard on the radio or TV. But you walk into the record store and you're probably going to see hundreds of different album covers. The album cover is supposed to give you an idea of what you're about to listen to. I know the saying goes, never judge a book by its cover, but in this case, that's just flat out wrong. You're absolutely judging the album by its cover. Records are pretty big too, and the album art is just right there, staring you in the face. You buy that record and take it home with you, it's like you're taking home a piece of art. A lot of the earliest albums that were pressed and widely released did not have the boldest album covers ever. Usually it was just a pretty cool picture of the artist in question. Again though, we're going to turn to the Beatles as being mold breakers here. In 1966, they released their 7th studio album, Revolver. The album art is pretty abstract and very beautiful, but it's really only a drop in the bucket compared to what the Beatles released the following year in 1967, the legendary Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I mean, just look at that album cover. It's insane, and it's from the 60s. Not only the album's front cover, but the back cover also had the lyrics printed on it. The inner gatefold has this picture of the 4 band members, and the album came out with this little slip of cutouts that I guess you could use as postmarks. And personally, I think the album cover does a fantastic job of letting you in on what this musical project is all about. Sonically, it's welcoming, but it's also epic. It's full of personality and color, but it's never overbearing. When all was said and done, the price tag for all of the album art was 3,000 British pounds, which, accounting for inflation today, is like 77,000 US dollars. To spend that much money on just your album art was completely unheard of at the time. And it typified a trend where musicians would commission their associates from the professional art world to make their album covers for them. Of course, you have the iconic cover of the Velvet Underground and Nico's 1967 album with Andy Warhol's fat signature right on the front. Fun fact, Andy Warhol actually managed the band at the time and even produced this album. Disraeli Gears by Cream in 1967, In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson in 1969. The list kind of goes on with crazy album covers from the 60s, but at this point, we're flying off the rails when it comes to abiding by pop standards. It's hard to quantify exactly the impact that this evolution in album art has had on music in general, but overall, I think it further solidifies the album as a true artistic statement. Not only are you assembling a collection of songs, but you're also having to find a strong visual representation of your album that an audience can latch onto. Up until this point of this essay, I have tried very hard to avoid using the specific word concept because there exists a thing called the concept album. What exactly is that? Well, defining it is a little nebulous, but the basic idea is that you have an album that focuses on a central theme or concept, or sometimes even has a straight up narrative. Each individual song in the album will contribute to that theme or concept, or it might even push the story itself forward. I previously mentioned that Frank Sinatra's 1955 album, In the Wee Small Hours, is popularly referenced as being the first ever concept album released to a wide audience. What exactly does that mean? Well, let's break down the content of the album just by reading off some of the names of the songs. Glad to Be Unhappy, I See Your Face Before Me, Can't We Be Friends, When Your Lover Has Gone, What Is This Thing Called Love, I'll Never Be the Same. Get the idea? It's essentially a breakup album, maybe the first breakup album ever. Yes, Frank Sinatra was the original sad boy. These days, the phrase breakup album might be a bit of a cliche, but keep in mind that this is 1955. Poor Frank Sinatra had his heart broken many times over the past 5 years, including a couple of divorces, and a very recent breakup that he cites as being the direct inspiration for this album. Instead of allowing his negative emotions to break him down, he channeled them to create a powerful artistic statement. Again, Frank didn't write any of the songs on the album, but he meticulously selected each track and rehearsed it relentlessly before mustering the courage to finally record it in the studio. As a listener, you should kind of walk away from this album with an understanding of Frank's heartbreak, what it's like to lose a lover, how you reminisce on that lost love, how you move on. But you can't just hear one song from the album on the radio to get the full picture. You have to listen to the entire album. It's not just a collection of individual tracks. It's more like one comprehensive listening experience. In the Wee Small Hours came out in 1955, but the mainstream appeal of albums was still like a decade away. So the impact of this album on the music landscape was not immediately noticeable. When we turn to the 60s, though, we start seeing a lot more concept albums. Again, because the term concept album is so loose, it's kind of hard to say what was the first true classic rock album that was a concept album that made a big enough splash to leave a lasting influence. We could turn to the Beatles again, but I'll spare you from having to endure more Beatles worship, at least for now. Instead, I'll highlight the first ever concept album that I personally listened to in high school, and that's Tommy by The Who, released in 1969. Essentially, like a rock opera, Tommy is maybe the most stereotypical definition of a concept album. It's also a double album. Clocking in at 75 minutes and containing 24 distinct tracks, the album tells the story of a young boy named Tommy who is deaf, mute, and blind. Throughout the album, Tommy faces many traumatic experiences from his family. He discovers that he's an expert-level pinball player even without being able to see or hear anything. He regains his senses at one point and starts a religious movement. It's all very zany and over the top, but I guess if you're telling a story only through song, you have to allow your imagination to be a little bit adventurous. The album performed pretty well for The Who, and a lot of people retrospectively look back on it as being The Who's breakout album. A notable aspect of the album is the particular track Pinball Wizard, which you can probably hear playing on your local classic rock radio station every week. It lands right in the middle of side 3 on the album, and while there's no denying that it's a very catchy and kind of goofy song that works great as a single, listening to it by itself is almost like reading the 13th chapter in a book that has 24 chapters. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just an interesting representation of how much, especially in such a short span of time, the artistic approach to writing an album has evolved. I don't imagine it's easy to ask someone to sit down and listen to your 75-minute opus about the adventures of a deaf, dumb, and blind kid. But you can soften the blow a little bit by providing your audience with an easy-to-digest sample of the album in the form of a good single. The song Pinball Wizard is exactly that. And the thing is, if you listen to the song as a single or you listen to it within the album, it's going to sound exactly the same in both places. But it serves two different functions in those contexts. It either moves a story forward or it's just a catchy, goofy song about a kid that's good at pinball. The lasting impact of Tommy is clear as day. You don't need to look any further than the 2004 Green Day album, American Idiot, another rock opera, and it's directly inspired by Tommy. Speaking of which, there's no shortage of amazing concept albums that have come out in the last decade or two. You have Janelle Monáe's Arcandroid in 2010, Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City in 2012, also Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly in 2015, Beyonce's Lemonade in 2018. The funny thing is, you could probably surprise some people by telling them that any of those last few albums are considered concept albums. And that's because that's something you don't need to know ahead of time in order to enjoy the album. You don't have to tune your expectations any differently. All those albums boast incredible songwriting and super compelling performances. There's also nothing wrong with listening to the song King Kunta by Kendrick Lamar on its own because it's a great fucking song. But when you consider the song a smaller piece of a larger whole, and you can appreciate how it contributes to the greater artistic statement that is To Pimp a Butterfly, it just makes the song that much more impactful and fulfilling. That's why artists release albums, and that's why we want to listen to albums. So it's been a bit of a slog, but we've reached the 70s, and I honestly struggled to decide what to put in this next section of the history lesson. That's not to say that there weren't great albums that came out in the 70s, quite the opposite. Plenty of the best-selling albums of all time were released in this decade. You have Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon in 1973, Rumors by Fleetwood Mac in 1977, and my personal all-time favorite album, Led Zeppelin IV in 1971. All in all, the 70s were a super prosperous decade for music history and record sales, but I guess there weren't as many game-changing evolutions as far as how to release your album. You can think of the 60s as laying the groundwork for the eventual record explosion that was the 70s. It's also important to consider the historical context because at the time there were considerably fewer modes of home entertainment. It wasn't until the late 70s that video game arcades or home video would take the world by storm. Sitting down and listening to an album to escape from your surroundings was possibly more popular as a hobby during this time period than in any other time period. By the late 70s, as home video became more popular and accessible, so too did another form of musical release, at least for mainstream artists, and that was movies based on albums. Now, I'm bringing this topic up in the 70s, but there is another band that was, yet again, kind of ahead of the curve on this one, and that's the Beatles. This project is really containing a lot more Beatles worship than I originally planned. Yes, in their short 7-year run together, the Beatles dropped 5 different movies based on albums, starting with A Hard Day's Night in 1964. And that's not to say that what the Beatles were doing was totally unprecedented. Plenty of musical films that we consider classics today were released in the 60s, like West Side Story, Mary Poppins, Sound of Music. Even Elvis had his fair share of acting roles in musical dramas and westerns in the 50s. The Beatles were really just the first to expose the popular music audience to this medium in such a big and successful way. In retrospect, the lasting impact and influence that the Beatles had in this vein just far outweighs anything that any of their contemporaries were doing. A Hard Day's Night is often recognized as being the first movie based on an album. Although when the Beatles wrote that album, it's not like they wrote it with a specific story in mind. The movie itself is just kind of a silly, fictionalized account of a day in the life of the Beatles. And of course it contains plenty of scenes of them rehearsing and performing songs off their album, Hard Day's Night. While the film is widely beloved and admittedly pretty funny, I don't think anyone would go out on a limb to say that it's some kind of grand artistic statement. The story is very bare bones, and the movie itself leans heavily on the music from the album. I'd argue that this is basically just a marketing ploy to get audiences to consume more Beatles content during Beatles Mania. But still, gotta give credit where credit is due, and the fact that the Beatles embraced the film format in such a big way with such success cannot be ignored. While the Beatles had their handful of movies in the 60s, I think the advent and increased popularity of concept albums and home video in the 70s culminated in some more daring attempts at musical films. The Who would actually release a film in 1975 based on their album Tommy. Unlike Hard Day's Night though, the movie Tommy does not feature the entire band, although the lead singer of The Who, Roger Daltrey, does portray the titular character Tommy. Because of the lack of band members, you actually see several instances of the actors in the movie performing songs off the album. Even though the album, Tommy itself, has a storyline, the song order in the movie is shuffled around considerably, and several new songs are added. A large number of the songs also feature new lyrics and instrumentation. Basically, while the film does pull largely from the original concept of the album Tommy, a lot of it gets lost in translating the album into a movie format. The musical film that I really want to highlight, though, that was extremely groundbreaking, although very polarizing in its reception, is The Wall by progressive rock band Pink Floyd. The album was released in 1979, and the movie was released in 1982. Now, the album The Wall is widely considered to be a classic in progressive rock and in rock music, in all of music in general. Has plenty of classic rock staples on it. It's another double album, and it's also a concept album. It clocks in at a whopping 81 minutes. So there's definitely a lot to work with in terms of turning it into a movie. The story of the album and movie it's something, all right. Like Tommy, you could consider The Wall to be a bit of a rock opera. The story goes that there's this main protagonist named Pink, When he's a kid, his father dies during World War II, and this traumatizes him and leads him to build a metaphorical wall that he surrounds himself with to keep out the outside world, I guess. Throughout the story, a lot of random shit happens to this kid. He gets tormented by teachers at school and by his mom. He grows up to be a drug-addicted rock star, and he gets married, but his wife cheats on him. At one point, he hallucinates that one of his performances is a neo-Nazi rally and that he's a fascist dictator. It's very comical almost. It's very over the top for sure. I guess in some ways it's perfect movie material. The thing that sets the movie The Wall apart from all of the other movies we've mentioned so far, though, is that it sonically follows the content of the album extremely closely. And I think this makes it a real precursor to what we today refer to as visual albums. The album contains 26 tracks, and 24 of them show up in the movie in almost the exact same order. There are some changes to the songs, and there's a couple new songs added, but none of the changes are that crazy. It's just some remixing on some of the songs, or some additional overdubs, or maybe some of the sections are re-recorded. I would argue that most of the changes to the songs here are just to fit the movie format a little bit better, and they don't at all trample on the original spirit of the album. The movie itself also features very little dialogue, so sound-wise, it's basically driven entirely by the music. In many ways, I think this is what makes The Wall basically a visual album, because you could listen to the album and have an experience with it, but when you watch the movie enhances your understanding of the album. It doesn't change it in any way. It just adds visual depth to the music that you're already familiar with. Now, for as groundbreaking as the movie is, the reception for it is admittedly very mixed. The visuals in the movie are extremely surreal, and the story, like I described, is kind of hard to keep track of. It's very all over the place. It's not necessarily the most compelling, but I think there's no denying that there was a trail blazed by Pink Floyd when they released this movie. It wasn't until the 2010s that the phrase visual album started to really get thrown around. But I would argue that Pink Floyd's The Wall planted the seed for the visual album more so than any other project. Towards the tail end of the 70s, there was actually a decline in LP record sales as the music industry faced competition from the commercial success of the film industry and from video game arcades. The success of MTV's music video programming also re-emphasized the single format in the 80s, helping to return the hit single to prominence as a pop marketing tool and also influencing record buyers' consuming habits towards disposable hits. Pop stars of the 80s like Madonna or Michael Jackson were able to galvanize interest in their album releases by releasing a lead single or a music video. Of course, in 1983, one of the most successful, influential, and iconic music videos ever was released. The nearly 14-minute long video for Michael Jackson's Thriller. Releases like this led to the development of the modern album launch, intended to drive an album's marketing momentum from weeks to months to sometimes even over a year. Over time, there became an unspoken checklist to releasing a major label album. Dropping a single, dropping an attention-grabbing music video, getting press coverage, announcing a supporting concert tour. Dependent on outlets like MTV that exclusively played hit songs, record companies put more pressure on artists to achieve mainstream viability more quickly. Another contributing factor to the LP record's downturn was from within the music sphere itself. Although the birth of the cassette tape was in 1963, it really had its cultural moment in the 70s and 80s, with the Walkman cassette player coming out in 1979. The cassette's popularity grew during these years because it was a more convenient and portable way to listen to music. Of course, there was also the introduction of the CD in 1979, along with the Discman CD player in 1984. These two mediums combined ignited the displacement of the LP record as the standard format for the album in the 80s. The introduction of the cassette player and the CD player changed everything for music consumers. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that it revolutionized the way that you can listen to music. I think you could also easily make the argument that the convenient and quick nature of being able to listen to music on the go just kind of lends itself more naturally towards snappy pop singles. When you're at the gym, when you're on your way to the grocery store, when you're on the subway for just a few stops, all these places where you don't have the time to fully invest in an album, you can just listen to a short, upbeat, exhilarating single as a pick-me-up. The spread of cassettes and CDs in the 80s also indirectly broke up the traditional flow of listening to an album. In the past, if you wanted to skip a song on a record, you'd have to get up, lift the needle, and move it over to the start of the next track. With a Discman or a Walkman, though, if you're in immediate range of the device, which you probably are if you're on the go, it's just a quick press of a button to skip a song that you don't feel like listening to. This makes it very easy to just listen to the same song over and over again, or maybe if you even have a full album, you can just skip to the lead single and breeze through the rest of the album. In the transition to CDs, many well-regarded records of the past were re-released on this new format. However, many LPs were overlooked for digital re-release because of legal or contractual obligations, or sometimes just because of oversight. Instead, such records were often rediscovered and collected through the now lost art form of crate digging, a practice championed by North American hip-hop producers who were seeking rare sounds to sample for their own recordings. If you want a quick 4-minute snapshot of this pastime, then listen no further than the 2000 track by rapper-producer Quasimodo, Return of the Loop Digger, from his album The Unseen. You might actually know Quasimodo better by his more popular pen name, Madlib. Legendary hip-hop producer, maybe even the most influential hip-hop producer of all time, honestly. If the topic of crate digging or music sampling in general interests you, then please stay tuned for a future project where I'll be diving into this topic in great detail. Pretty please, stay tuned. One fun, somewhat short-lived, and I would say underappreciated tradition that was popularized by the CD was the hidden track. A hidden track is a song on an album, typically the last song, and it's placed in such a way to avoid detection by the listener. So you could leave your CD player on when an album ends. You know that the last song that was on the track listing has already played, but bam, suddenly you're listening to another song that you didn't even know was on the album. It's like a little surprise that reels you in to listen more closely to the true outro song of the album. So how do you hide a track? Well, in most cases, you would just leave the song off the album's track listing. While in other cases, more elaborate methods are used. You even have artists going as far as Kamasi Washington, modern saxophonist and jazz kingpin, whose 2018 double album, Heaven and Earth, was actually a triple album in disguise, with the third disc hidden inside the packaging of the CD or the record. Like, what the fuck? Hidden tracks are fun, though. It's like a song that plays during the credits of a movie, except for an album. You could think of it as a bonus track, although those two phrases, hidden track, bonus track, have slightly different connotations. The tradition of hidden tracks was popularized by CDs, but you could even do the same thing on vinyl. You could have a hidden track simply by omitting the song from the track listing, just like with a CD, but it's a vinyl record. The grooves on the vinyl are really easy to see. It wouldn't be hard to read the track listing for an album, see that it says 5 songs, but then look at your vinyl record and see that there's actually 6 different tracks with the grooves. Not really a hidden track in that sense. But this did not stop people from getting creative. One thing you could do was combine your final song on the track listing with the hidden track and make it one ultra-long final song and groove on the album. You could also separate these 2 songs with a period of silence. One of the first hidden tracks, sometimes referred to as the first hidden track, and one of the most popular hidden tracks is, of course, by the Beatles off their 1969 album Abbey Road. On that album, the final song, titled The End, ends with 14 seconds of silence before the true final song, Her Majesty, finishes the album off for the listener. Funny enough, the creation of this hidden track was actually a complete accident. The song, Her Majesty, was actually originally meant to serve as an interlude between the songs Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam. But Paul McCartney decided that he didn't quite like that sequence of songs, so he removed it from the album. He even instructed the tape operator that they were working with in the studio to destroy the tape completely. But EMI, the record label that the Beatles were working with at the time, had a policy that specifically stated that no recording of the Beatles was to ever be destroyed. So somehow, the song got left at the end of the album after 14 seconds of silence. Her Majesty is only 23 seconds long. And it starts off with this really loud chord, which, as recorded, is actually the ending of Mean Mr. Mustard. Then the song ends abruptly because its own final note was left at the beginning of Polythene Pam. So, in essence, if you left the album playing, and then the final song ends, and then there's 14 seconds of silence, you're effectively met with a bit of a jump scare. The first time that Paul McCartney ended up hearing this, he loved the surprise effect, and then the song ended up becoming the unintended closer for the album. Another interesting example, although not exactly a hidden track per se, is the end of the 1970 album by Pink Floyd, Atom Heart Mother. The final 13-minute song on the album is titled Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, and it's a pretty relaxing, slightly psychedelic instrumental track that also contains recordings of one of the band's roadies at the time, named Alan, preparing and eating his breakfast and talking about breakfast in general and talking about breakfasts that he's eaten in the past. I know it sounds a little ridiculous, but it's actually a very nice song. I would recommend it. The interesting part, though, is that when the song ends, you hear Alan exiting the kitchen where he's been preparing and eating his breakfast, and you can hear the sound of the kitchen faucet dripping. On some copies of the vinyl record, the dripping tap sound is actually cut into the runoff groove on the record. So if you were to leave your record player going, the needle would get caught on this inside groove, and you would hear the sound of a dripping faucet forever, until you remove the stylus from the record at least. But in essence, that means the song could last forever. I know this seems like a very random and not so exciting example, but I think it's a very fun and creative gem to add to the end of your album. It adds like a layer of interactivity to the album listening experience by almost breaking the fourth wall. You're sitting there listening to the album, and then the last song ends, and you just hear several minutes of a faucet dripping. You're just like, what is this? Is the album still playing? Is this still the same song? What's going on? It's such a novel way to add and hide an Easter egg in your album. But it gets even more creative than that. Arguably the most creative hidden track of all time finds itself on the 1973 album titled The Monty Python Matching Tie and Handkerchief. Yes, that's correct. The comedy troupe behind some of the most classic and beloved comedy films of all time wrote this album. And the second half of the record is actually comprised of two parallel grooves, so that each time you listen to the second half of the record, different material might play depending on where on the surface of the vinyl you put down the stylus, which essentially makes this record a three-sided record. The album also didn't have a printed track listing, so it was basically impossible to know about this going into it. I mean, if Pink Floyd broke the fourth wall, then this album just completely burns the house down. Imagine listening to this album one day, and then the next day you have like a friend over or something and you're listening to the album again. You flip the record over and you start listening to the second side, but it's completely new music that you hadn't heard the day before. You'd think you're going crazy or something. I just think the idea of hiding something on your album is such an interesting evolution in the way that artists can express themselves and almost reach out to their audiences. As the listener, it can make you feel like you're not just sitting there listening to a piece of music that you have nothing to do with. You're a part of the music listening experience. You're interacting with the art that you're listening to. It's just so creative and I love it. I took all this time to talk about hidden tracks on vinyl and how artists usually have to go to great lengths just to hide their tracks from attentive music listeners. But on CDs, it's much easier. You just put your song at the end of the album or wherever and just leave it off of the track listing on the packaging. As a consumer, you can't just look at a CD and garner any information about how much music is really on it. So the only way to know if there's actually a hidden track on the album is to listen to the whole album. Or I guess you could start the album and skip through all the tracks to look at the numbering to find out that way, but that's no fun. On top of that, the amount of music that you could fit onto a CD, around 70 or 80 minutes, compared to the length of traditional albums released before the CD, which rarely topped around 45 minutes, allowed artists to play with the CD format in general. The ease of being able to hide tracks on both cassette and CD created a boom for the hidden track tradition. One of the earliest and most prominently referenced hidden tracks from the CD era lands on the grunge pioneer band Nirvana's 1991 album, Nevermind. The final song on the album's track listing, Something in the Way, clocks in at just about 4 minutes. But then the track keeps playing for 10 minutes of silence before the real final song on the album, titled Endless Nameless, starts to play. That song clocks in at just under 7 minutes. Put all those segments together and you've got one final song that actually lasts upwards of 20 minutes, but is really just two different songs separated by a long gap of silence. There's also the legendary 1998 album, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, of course by the ever enigmatic neo-soul contemporary R&B singer, rapper, songwriter Lauryn Hill. That album actually has two hidden tracks, and one of them is a cover of Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons' Can't Take My Eyes Off You. That cover is the first hidden track to ever get nominated for a Grammy, although unfortunately it did not win. So far, all of the hidden tracks that I've mentioned have been placed at the end of their respective albums. However, a more extreme example of hiding a song on an album can be done using the pre-gap on a CD. CDs allowed for an inclusion of a song on the pre-gap, which is the space that comes before the start of the first song. The only way to access this song would be to start the album and press rewind after starting track 1, which effectively makes a song on the pre-gap track 0. The track is truly hidden in the sense that most conventional standalone CD players and software CD players cannot detect it. In fact, some CD drives will just run into errors when trying to extract this song, Or some of them will seem like they extracted the song properly, but then the file is just silence. Probably the most popular example of an artist hiding a song on their album in this way. It's pretty modern, all things considered, and it comes on indie rock band Arcade Fire's 2013 album, Reflector. The album includes a 10-minute instrumental track played in reverse, included before the start of the actual first track. Now, I personally love this album. I personally think it's right up there with Arcade Fire's best albums. I own the CD, I bought it the day it came out, I've exported the songs onto iTunes, I've listened to the discs on my car's CD player, but before doing research for and writing the script, I had never once heard of the fact that this album had a hidden track. I mean, it can't just be me, right? This is like a really well-kept secret or something. I think there's a fine line to this art form of hidden tracks, if you will, and maybe making a track this hidden on your album kind of makes it pointless. It makes it feel more like a joke or a gag that was kind of tacked onto your album as opposed to something that is inherent to the album's listening experience. Either way, the passing of the CD era and the advent of music streaming has all but done away with the fad of hidden tracks. When everything's just a file, there's simply nowhere to hide anymore. For example, if you were to look up the album Nevermind by Nirvana on Spotify or Apple Music right now, you wouldn't find one humongous 20-minute track at the end of the album. You'd just find two perfectly normal and separate songs at the end of the album. Same thing with Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. You'd see those two hidden songs listed plain as day at the end of the album. And in the case of both of these albums, those originally hidden tracks are not listed or titled or referenced in any way as being hidden. Also, if you look up Reflector, you're actually not going to find that song that's hidden on the pre-gap available for streaming. I guess it's still as elusive today as it was the day the album came out. Also, with the spike in popularity of playlists on music streaming, which we'll touch on later, no one wants to hear a 20-minute song that includes 10 minutes of silence. Now, there are still some modern instances of artists hiding tracks at the end of their albums, just like Nirvana did originally, by combining two songs onto one track, even on streaming. Rapper and linguist extraordinaire A$AP Rock does this at the end of his 2007 album, None Shall Pass. And R&B singer Daniel Caesar does this at the end of his 2017 album, Freudian. But even in these cases, you can clearly see that both of the last songs on these albums have really long runtimes on streaming. So if you're paying close attention, you'd notice that one song seemingly ends even though the track itself has several minutes left. But I guess it's nice to know that some artists are still trying to keep this relic of music history alive. Since we're already talking about hidden tracks, I also wanted to take some time to talk about interludes on albums. This is admittedly a pretty arbitrary place to put this section in the essay, but honestly, I just have no idea when interludes became a thing in music culture, at least in the album context. Nevertheless, they share a similar niche as hidden tracks. What exactly is an interlude? That in itself can be a little bit hard to define, but it's generally a short track that serves as a segue between other songs on an album. It could be instrumental, it could be a skit, but I think the important characteristic is that it's not meant to be enjoyed on its own. It's meant to push an album listening experience forward. It's a smaller part of a greater whole. The rise of new digital platforms and instant online distribution, artists can often release standalone singles that might never appear on any album. Instant gratification and the comfort of our smartphones makes the use of interludes almost redundant, because at the moment, listeners are not obligated to listen to an entire album from front to back. But in the day of records, cassettes, and CDs, musicians would often expect their listeners to hear an album all in one go or as one long piece. So interludes made more sense. Now, trying to determine what exactly counts as an interlude, that is also a little difficult. These days, artists can make it pretty straightforward for the listener by including the actual word interlude or skit or reprise in the name of the song itself, or just by straight up naming the song intro or interlude. Stargirl interlude by The Weeknd, Liability reprise by Lorde, Skits 1 through 4 by Kanye West on Late Registration, but you could go as far back as the 1966 album Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. On that album, there's a 2-minute instrumental track, the title song, Pet Sounds. Does that count as an interlude? It certainly seems to serve a greater purpose in the album's track listing than just being an individual song that can stand on its own 2 feet. We could argue this point all day, but I think the special part about interludes is that they show that the artist has the bigger picture in mind. They're thinking about crafting the entire album. When they're done right, interludes can transform an album from being a collection of songs to being a narrative. Even if they're done mid-song, They can transform a piece of music into a story. They're also opportunities for musicians to switch up styles and transition. They're the connective tissue that holds albums together. Some artists like to use the song at the beginning of an album to set the stage for what's to come. A couple of my personal favorite songs that contain the actual word intro in the name of the song are the track Intro from indie rock band Alt J's 2014 album, This Is All Yours, and the track Long Time Intro from cloud rap superstar Playboi Carti's 2018 album, Die Lit. These songs are certified bangers, and when I listen to them, they just put me in the mood to listen to the rest of their respective albums. In the same vein as the interlude is the skit, although the specific word skit typically connotates a hip-hop context. Generally, they serve the same purpose as interludes. They act as transitions that are an integral part of the story that the artist is trying to tell. But commonly, skits aren't even musical tracks themselves. They might be recordings of a telephone conversation or a voicemail, or they might be conversations that are acted out by the artists themselves. Stereotypically, they have comedic value, or they at least try to. From the early 90s right up until the end of the 2000s, the inclusion of album skits became the norm in hip-hop. Hip-hop as a genre didn't really find its footing until the 80s, which is when the CD became popularized anyways. So rappers weren't confined by the limitations of the LP record because they weren't born of it. Thus, they often used the CD format to its fullest. It wasn't unusual for the biggest rap albums to span 20 or more tracks thanks to multiple skits or segues that tried and sometimes succeeded to make us laugh. I mean, would the classic 1994 East Coast hip-hop album Ready to Die by Notorious B.I.G. be the same without the extremely raunchy and audacious Fuck Me interlude by Lil' Kim? Definitely not. Skits also serve to highlight hip-hop's historical connection with the long tradition of African-American oral storytelling, one that included ghost stories, tall tales, sermons, and performative toasts. By expanding the backstory or backstage antics of the album's performers, skits encourage the listener to invest in an album as not just a collection of songs, but as an atmosphere. The skit was more or less pioneered by the East Coast hip-hop trio De La Soul and their producer, Prince Paul, who incorporated many skits on their 1989 debut album, 3 Feet High and Rising. Paul says, "We did it to fill the void, to give our album some structure. It was just something that we tried out and
it evolved.
We never thought it would become a rap album staple." However, an even earlier example of the skit can be found at the end of the Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five 1982 rap anthem, The Message. That song, which is, by the way, possibly the most iconic hip-hop song of all time, ends with a skit where all of the band members are arrested for no reason. The full album experience just didn't mesh with the world of MP3s, MySpace, and YouTube. Spotify doesn't play skits for a reason. In today's streaming chaos, few things seem more anachronistic than including skits. And when a skit does crop up sometimes, even the most playful interlude can immediately kill the vibe of a playlist, demanding an immediate skip. But there are still a handful of artists today who are successfully reworking the hip-hop skit in the modern streaming era. A special shout-out must absolutely go out to Kendrick Lamar. One of the most gifted storytellers we've ever seen, Kendrick Lamar elevated his craft on his 2012 sophomore album, Good Kid, Mad City, through the use of voicemails that pulled listeners directly into the world of Compton. With cinematic precision, the missed voicemails from his parents, the phone recording of Kendrick getting jumped, the phone recordings of him and his friends freestyling in their car or planning a robbery. These skits help weave a narrative that embody the very best of 90s skits, but totally reinvented. Kendrick didn't stop there either. His 2015 follow-up, To Pimp a Butterfly, easily one of the most critically acclaimed and widely discussed albums of this century, reverently revisits and repurposes a wide swath of African-American musical history. Ambitiously conceived, the album doesn't neatly divide into catchy singles and thematic connective tissue. It sustains its intensity over the course of 80 minutes. The songs are skits and the skits are songs. Mortal Man, the 12-minute closing track, ends with an extremely bold statement. A supernatural skit that puts Kendrick Lamar in conversation with the late Tupac Shakur, whose comments are taped snippets from a 1994 interview. It's a risky and even cocky gesture on Kendrick's part, positioning himself as a descendant of one of the greats, while the late Tupac has no say in the matter. But in practice, the conversation that the two of them have is engaging, topical, and full of mutual respect. Kendrick is mainly there to ask questions about faith, opportunity, the politics of Black manhood, and to listen to answers. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that turns music fans into music nerds. Instead of retreating from a tired and overdone historical music tradition, Kendrick carries on the tradition by completely flipping it on its head and reinventing it, creating skits that you simply cannot skip. I could gush about Kendrick Lamar all day, but let's move on. At the turn of the 2000s, physical LP records were facing a crazy amount of competition on all fronts. MP3 downloads, CD shufflers, not to mention video games, cable television, the internet, and the worldwide explosion of media in general were all competing for the attention span of album buyers. In March of 1998, the first ever MP3 player, the MP-Man F10, debuted in Asia. In 1999, the internet peer-to-peer file sharing service Napster allowed users to easily and illegally download single songs as MP3s, which had been ripped from the digital files located on CDs. Napster was eventually shut down in 2001 for copyright violations, but several other music download services quickly took its place. Also in 2001, Apple's iTunes service was introduced, and the iPod was released later that year, soon to be joined by similar legal alternatives. On iTunes, you can purchase music that you want digitally, and then listen to it on your iPod on the go. A game-changing feature that came with this is that you could buy individual tracks instead of just buying an entire album. In a sense, this was a huge blow to the concept of interludes that we just discussed, because typically a music listener would want to buy their favorite singles from an album or just the entire album itself. But most definitely, the interludes would receive the smallest amount of individual love. The rise of the MP3 basically decoupled the song from the album. iTunes and marketplaces like it, along with the rise in illicit file sharing, led to further decline in the sales of recorded music on physical formats. Throughout the 2000s on iTunes, there was a traceable shift in consumer purchasing preference to download individual songs versus the higher-priced album. In 2006, CD sales were for the first time outnumbered by single downloads. With the rise of digital media in the 2000s, collecting music went from being physical to being digital and electronic. The demise of physical music stores allowed for websites to emerge as domains for album collecting, including the collaborative music review site Rate Your Music in 2000. The very first music streaming titan, Pandora, was also introduced in 2000, and the reigning music streaming titan, Spotify, was introduced in 2006. The mid to late 2000s also saw the rapid rise and fall of MySpace, a social network which provided indie musicians with a platform to stream their music to interested users for free. While the company would fade to obscurity in 2009, MySpace played a huge role in launching the careers of several UK indie acts, including the likes of Arctic Monkeys. The phrase "death of the album" was prominently thrown around during this period in time, and was usually attributed to internet sharing, downloading, and the changing expectations of music listeners. Many people genuinely believed that artists would pursue less album-oriented campaigns, while consumers would prefer listening to playlists instead of albums. The competition faced by albums from playlists explodes exponentially with the increase in popularity of music streaming services, in my opinion. As always, it's easy to make judgments with hindsight, but perhaps this steep decline in the popularity of the album can largely be attributed to record companies for failing to recognize the inevitability of streaming as the favored means of music distribution. So with the internet running rampant in the 2000s and record labels basically floundering to adopt this new ecosystem, artists were kind of getting the short end of the stick. To be fair, even in 2021, artists are still kind of getting the short end of the stick, but I suppose that's a story for another time. For the past 50 some odd years, artists have been comfortable with the tried and true marketing flow of making an album, releasing it physically, and expecting people to buy it. This system simply does not transfer well to the internet because it's so easy for people to find music illegally and for free. The idea of having listeners pay for convenient and high-quality music streaming services was also not popularized yet, so artists were just stuck in this limbo of making less money on their albums. There needed to be a way to adapt. What exactly that way was unclear, but somebody needed to try something. Enter the alternative rock band Radiohead circa 2007 and their album In Rainbows. The rollout of this album is actually notable for several reasons. Its initial release was via the internet before a physical version was available. Getting a piece of music into the ears of a music listener is way faster via the internet than via a record store. With that luxury in mind, on October 1st, 2007, the band's lead guitarist Jonny Greenwood announced the band's 7th studio album on the Radiohead blog, writing, "Well, the new album is finished and it's coming out in 10 days. We've called it In Rainbows." Announcing an album 10 days before it's available for purchase was completely unheard of at the time. Typically, an album promotion cycle could last several months. I previously mentioned the checklist that typically comes with releasing an album. dropping a single or music video first, announcing a tour, getting all this press coverage to get people excited about the eventual album's drop date. Instead of this, Radiohead recognized the fast-paced nature and convenience of the internet and used that to their advantage to essentially drop the first ever surprise album. More on that topic later, but for right now, I want to specifically highlight a perhaps even more groundbreaking aspect of the release of this album, and that was its price. The blog post contained a link to inrainbows.com where users could pre-order an MP3 version of the album for any price they wanted, including nothing at all. Radiohead was allowing you to go online and buy their new album for free. I mean, this is a landmark in music history. Bands at Radiohead's level of popularity had simply never done anything like this before. The music industry at large was still furiously working to stave off the rapid encroachment of the internet. But here was one of the most beloved bands of all time, embracing the technology and suggesting a way to operate within it. Something that we take for granted in the age of streaming is the availability of music. We know that on midnight at Fridays, that's when new music and albums drop and are available for everyone to listen to. But it wasn't always like that. You used to have to wait for the record store to open, then physically go there and be in line to get it, and then take the record home with you and listen to it there. But on October 10th, 2007, at midnight, in a beautiful moment of community, everyone and their mother was in front of their computer listening to In Rainbows by Radiohead at the same time. Now, in the end, this was just an experiment. 2 months after the album's release date, it was removed for download and physical versions became available for purchase. Radiohead has also not used the pay what you want system for any of their subsequent releases. Looking back on the stats as well, almost 2/3 of the downloads ended up being for free anyways. But was the experiment a failure? Absolutely not. Far from it. It was Radiohead showing the music industry that artists wanted new ways to reach out to their audiences. You don't need to look any further than the hugely successful online music platform Bandcamp to see that this business model is still alive and booming. On Bandcamp, which was founded in 2008 and is the universally loved music platform of the internet, artists and labels upload music and also merchandise and control how they sell it, setting their own prices and giving fans the option to pay more if they want. Uploading music to Bandcamp is free, and the company only takes a 15% cut of sales made from their platform. Compare this to Spotify, where it generally takes 250 streams of your song to generate $1. If you want your heart warmed even more, then know that during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, Bandcamp announced that they would be waiving their revenue share and donating all sales to artists for 24 hours on March 20th. They repeated the initiative in the following months and began calling these days Bandcamp Fridays, happening on the first Friday of every month. As of the recording of this video, the program has been extended into 2021 as well. By no means is the pay what you want model ever going to overtake modern music streaming. People will always love free stuff. But for music obsessives and music nerds, Bandcamp is the perfect platform to support the artists that you love and also find new music. By the way, do you like the music that I've been using to segue between different segments so far? Well, if you do, then you should know that it comes from the 2017 album Polygon Wonderland by the Australian psychedelic rock band King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Am I even allowed to be using their music like this? Well, as prompted by the band, yes. When Polygon Wonderland was officially announced, the band stated, "This album is free, free as in free," encouraging fans to make their own copies and bootlegs of the album. The band said that they would not be selling the album in any shape or form, even going as far as putting the master tapes online for free use. In a tweet, the band later clarified, "Polygon Wonderland does not belong to us. Anyone can sell it, make money off of it, listen to it, sync it, put it in their movie, play it at their party, whatever they want." Masters and artwork files can be downloaded from the band's website for personal use and also for actually pressing CDs and vinyls yourself. On the day of the album's announcement, dozens of labels announced that they would be producing their own physical versions of the album. Of note was that the band released this album as a part of their ongoing 2017 project to release 5 albums in 1 year. This was the 4th album released by the band that year, and at the time, the band's lead singer, Stu McKenzie, had said that they'd been receiving so much positive support and love for their other 2017 albums that they felt bad asking fans to spend more money on yet another project. So they released the album as free as possible in the most open sense of the word. Granted, this did happen relatively recently, but I've never seen an artist release an album in this way ever before in history, at least not on a scale this large. Not only was the album available for free, but the band was basically letting anyone make money off the album by pressing and selling physical copies of it. Also by using the music as copyright-free music in projects just like what I'm doing right now. In the same way that In Rainbows was a magical moment of community, so too was Polygon Wonderland. For sure, King Gizzard is not quite as wide-reaching of a band as Radiohead, But for several weeks after the album had been released, you could see people on internet forums discussing which record label they planned on buying their album from. You had people designing different album covers. Fans also started crowdfunding campaigns on sites like Facebook and Kickstarter to start producing their own versions of the album. The idea of releasing your album in this way turned the event from just a plain old album release to basically an open source art project that anyone could get in on. Very exciting, very open-minded, and very unheard of. And it doesn't hurt that the music on the album is also fucking awesome. Over the course of the 2010s, record labels generally invested in streaming platforms like Spotify and Pandora, with strategies focused on curated playlists and individual tracks instead of albums. Pandora created an online service which recommended new music based on a user's listening history, the ambitious Music Genome Project, allowing users to bookmark artists and discover new acts. While it certainly took a while to gain traction, there's no denying that Pandora heavily influenced modern streaming services like Spotify. Spotify in particular, for better or worse, became a dominant and redefining platform for music consumption in the 2010s. Services like Spotify and Apple Music have moved our music libraries from personal hard drives, iPods, and CDs into the cloud. With consumers abandoning albums, more performers focused on releasing hit singles, a trend that has produced many one-hit wonders. The big game changer that I want to highlight in today's modern age is the playlist, and more specifically, the robo playlist, as my friend likes to call it. By robo playlist, I mean a playlist that has been procedurally generated by an algorithm, as opposed to being generated by human curation. You guys know what I mean. I'm talking about your daily mixes, your Discover Weekly, your Release Radar, all of these playlists that get created by robots. No human intervention necessary. For many, the playlist has effectively destroyed the album. In today's music landscape, playlists are huge moneymakers. A lot of the ideas and experiments that I've previously talked about with albums, like hiding 2 songs in one, or adding interludes and skits to your album, nobody wants to hear that shit on a playlist. They want to hear banger after banger. At a certain point, if everyone is only listening to playlists, then artists have to ask themselves, what am I doing? Why am I writing an album? Nobody wants to sit through an entire album anymore. I should just focus on writing the snappiest, catchiest, hookiest single possible so I have the best chance of getting picked up by a robo playlist. Today, streaming is one of the largest sources of revenue for musicians. Users can pay a monthly subscription to hear the music that they want to hear immediately and without ads, or they can use the free versions of streaming services, braving limited artist libraries and annoying ads. But at what cost does this come to the artist? Do they now miss out on revenue share that they'd otherwise be receiving from album sales? That's not an easy question to answer. Artists like Taylor Swift and Thom Yorke of Radiohead have been vocal in their criticism of online music streaming practices. Meanwhile, rap mogul Jay-Z launched his own streaming service, Tidal, in protest of free streaming, offering higher quality audio and exclusive releases at a higher subscription price, as well as more lucrative compensation for artists being streamed. According to Business Insider, as of February 2021, Spotify reportedly pays in between $0.003 and $0.005 per stream, meaning you'll need about 250 streams to earn $1. However, streaming services do provide artists with an infinite exposure platform via curated playlists, listener analytics, and recommendations to similar artists to help build an international following and gain attention. While the debate around music streaming carries on, it's evident that today's services are certainly a huge improvement over the practices of Napster, for example, and the ability to access the entire library of recorded work of almost any artist from the confines of your pocket is certainly an enticing prospect. Like it or not, music streaming seems to be here to stay, at least for a good while. Just do yourself a favor and upgrade to premium. It's definitely worth it. Of note is that 2017 is commonly believed to be the year that hip-hop music became the most popular genre, more popular than rock music, in the United States. It's not like this change happened overnight. It was, of course, bubbling over the past decade plus. But with this changing of the throne comes a whole new ideology of music marketing, music ownership, and trend setting in general. Take the massively popular rapper Drake, for example. He has the ability to sustain his popular appeal over time with single track releases, and has basically mastered the digital age's desire for both instant gratification and long-term anticipation. While we're on the topic of hip-hop and how its popularity has dictated trends for the past decade plus, we can take some time to talk about the mixtape format. A mixtape is, we'll say, a compilation of music. With its origin in the 1980s, the term used to describe a homemade compilation of music made onto a cassette tape, CD, or digital playlist. In hip-hop culture, a mixtape often describes a self-produced or independently released album, issued free of charge to gain publicity or sometimes to avoid copyright infringement because of uncleared music samples. However, the term mixtape has been slapped onto plenty of for-profit releases in the 2010s, and the line between a mixtape and a true studio album has become increasingly blurred. The name itself comes from the cassette tape. Homemade mixtapes became pretty common in the 1980s. As cassette tapes and recorders grew in popularity and portability, the technological hurdles of recording onto them were lowered, to the point where the only resources required to create a mix were a handful of cassettes and a cassette recorder connected to a source of pre-recorded music, such as a radio or a record player. As such, the original mixtapes were truly just mixes of pre-recorded instrumentation. Mixtapes were some of the first building blocks for hip-hop culture, appearing as early as the mid-70s in New York City. And throughout the 80s, mixtapes were a highly visible element of youth culture. However, the increased availability of CD burners and MP3 players and the gradual disappearance of cassette players in cars and households led to a decline in the popularity of the cassette tape as a medium for homemade mixes. So while the spirit of the mixtape lives on, its physical form has been replaced by mixed CDs and eventually playlists. Because mixtapes were usually independently made, they would often serve as stepping stones for up-and-coming rappers who were trying to get into the music game. It's not uncommon for rappers to drop several mixtapes to their name before dropping their first true debut album, an event which is typically reserved for a pretty monumental occasion in an artist's career. Rap purists would say that perhaps no other hip-hop artist in history has ever executed and leveraged mixtapes to his benefit, quite like 50 Cent. His name is almost synonymous with the word mixtape. 50 Cent helped to build the traditional mixtape model as it's now commonly understood. An artist raps and freestyles over popular pre-existing beats, and then self-releases the project. 50's mixtape tracks were so popular that they'd often get played at nightclubs and had mass appeal across the country. 50 rode the momentum he built through his mixtapes onto one of the best-selling debut studio albums of all time in 2003's Get Rich or Die Tryin'. In the mid-2000s, as the music industry and the law cracked down on the physical mixtape economy, the selling of uncleared samples in production, which violated copyright law, the internet stepped in with an alternative system. Sites like DatPiff and Live Mixtapes began giving fans access to mixtapes for free, in exchange for exclusivity, which generated site traffic that could be sold for ads. Fans gained unparalleled access to new music. During this period in time, dropping a free mixtape was both a rapper's rite of passage and also a powerful way to connect directly with fans. Drake's So Far Gone in 2009 and A$AP Rocky's Live, Love, ASAP in 2011 are prime examples of artists breaking onto the scene in a big way, making names for themselves and utilizing the mixtape format until eventually graduating to full-length studio albums. Over the years, mixtapes have become a standard vehicle for rappers and also artists not directly related to the genre. The definition of mixtape has also evolved to include projects that have original beats and production. Of course, you have The Weeknd and his critically lauded trilogy of mixtapes in 2011, House of Balloons, Thursday, and Echoes of Silence. You have Mac Miller, who built out his catalog with several mixtapes before finally dropping his debut album in 2011. Dropping your debut album is also not a hard stop for ever releasing mixtapes again. 3 years after his debut album, Mac Miller dropped the highly celebrated and very awesome Faces mixtape in 2014. There is also Chance the Rapper, who independently released his first 3 mixtapes over the 2010s. His 2013 mixtape Acid Rap in particular is a very wonderful project, full of personality, color, and extremely eccentric ad-libs. It's a must-listen for anyone even remotely interested in hip-hop. It's become clear to some labels that clearing samples on major artists' mixtapes is worth the trouble. In part thanks to streaming, the definition and role of the mixtape has expanded, giving artists an opportunity to build their merit, establish their fan base, and be recognized on the charts for it. Even though it's become increasingly more difficult to draw the line between commercial mixtapes and official records, there's a rhyme and reason to why the mixtape has remained a significant artifact in music. You even have non-hip-hop artists like Charli XCX riding on waves of popularity, with her 2 mixtapes, Number One Angel and Pop 2, both released in 2017. Also in 2017, Drake dropped what he dubbed a playlist titled More Life. Do these listening experiences differentiate themselves from typical album listening experiences? Not really, in my opinion, but I guess it's a cheeky way for artists to say, hey, I've got this musical project that you should listen to. And if you like it, well, just wait until I drop a full-fledged studio album on you. briefly teased the topic of surprise albums when I mentioned Radiohead's 2007 album In Rainbows earlier, but let's take some time to dig deeper into this topic. A surprise album refers to an album which is released with little to no prior announcement, marketing, or promotion. Of course, this completely contradicts the typical album release cycle that we've mentioned many times. The latter half of the 2010s trended toward minimal marketing for hip-hop album releases, oftentimes with announcements in the form of social media posts containing the album's cover art, the track listing, and the release date, sometimes with just a few weeks' notice. But how did we get here? Well, the strategy developed in part due to the prevalence of album leaks on the internet in the 2000s and became popular by the mid-2010s among high-profile recording acts. Yes, one thing that we haven't touched on yet is that the creation of the internet and how readily available everything is led to a significant increase in the amount of albums and singles being leaked to audiences before their intended release date. This still happens from time to time, and it's not specific to just the music realm. There's plenty of instances of video game information getting leaked, spoilers to TV shows getting leaked, etc. To prevent the unwanted attention of hackers or troublemakers in general, you could just avoid even acknowledging the existence of your album right up until the moment that it's available for release to all audiences anyways. It's really an interesting evolution of the album release cycle, born out of necessity in some ways, but transformed into a true marketing tactic in its own right. Again, Radiohead's 2007 studio album In Rainbows is often considered to be the first true surprise album. Its release was announced 10 days prior on the band's blog. Radiohead's bassist Colin Greenwood stated that the band had several motivations behind the way they released the album, including the increased popularity of the internet as a tool for discovering music, frustrations with the traditional release and promotion format, the freedom of not being signed to a record label at the time, a desire to do something special and unique, and an interest in broadcasting their music directly to listeners globally at the same time. They followed up with their next album in 2011, The King of Limbs, announcing that album 5 days before release, and then even dropping it a day early. In a similar vein of trying to preempt internet leaks, Frank Ocean announced that his debut studio album Channel Orange was going to be dropped on July 17th, 2012. But then 1 week earlier, on July 10th, he released the album digitally, which is what he planned to do all along. Even Kendrick Lamar employed this idea with To Pimp a Butterfly, when the album was announced on March 10th, 2015, with a release date of March 24th, it dropped 8 days ahead of schedule. The power couple Jay-Z and Beyonce are often credited as mastering the surprise album release strategy. Jay-Z, of course, being a jack of all trades in the form of East Coast hip-hop rapper, businessman, record executive, you name it. And Beyonce, of course, being the ultra-popular queen bee of this generation, art pop, alternative R&B, pop rap extraordinaire. The couple started their run of surprise albums in 2013 with Beyonce's self-titled album, which was made available for listening the moment it was announced, followed by her 2016 album Lemonade, which was announced with 6 days' notice. The couple then surprise released the collaborative album Everything Is Love, billed as being by the Carters. The day this album came out, June 16th, 2018, Jay-Z and Beyonce were actually on their joint tour together. At the end of their second show at London, Beyonce announced that the couple had a surprise for the audience before leaving stage. Then the music video for the song Apeshit, off the album Everything Is Love, played on the video screen on stage. Following the conclusion of the video, the words "Album Out Now" came across the screen. Everything Is Love was subsequently and exclusively released on Jay-Z's streaming service Tidal, and all of the members of the audience received a 6-month free trial to the subscription so that they can stream the album. You have to understand that Jay-Z and Beyonce combined are two of the most popular and well-known artists of their time. They're basically household names. So to be able to pull something like this off, to announce an album that's never even been acknowledged before publicly and make it available for streaming immediately, that's got to take like a whole rainforest's worth of non-disclosure agreements. The hype that a move like this generates is insane. It basically lights the internet on fire. Everyone's going to be online talking about how they managed to release this album without anyone knowing about it. And that's going to generate a whole bunch of free press for the artists. It's the complete opposite of the traditional album release cycle that we've come to know. They basically lurk in the shadows for a few months while they're working on the album, and then they steal the spotlight for themselves at the very last second. Releasing an album in this way, without releasing any singles ahead of time, essentially forces listeners to sit through the entire album. If there's no single or music video prior to the album's release, then fans have nothing to latch onto. They have to listen to the whole album, and in a way end up picking the single for the artist. As opposed to trying to predict ahead of time which single on an album is going to be most well received, this makes it safer and easier to put funds behind whatever songs listeners are already positively responding to. And this, in my opinion, is one of the prime arguments why albums can never be replaced by just singles. If your entire catalog only consists of singles, then the act of dropping a single just becomes less special. It's less of a headlining moment. Singles are definitely a necessary tool for artists to promote themselves, but you don't always know if you're picking the best song off your album to be a single. A great example of this in action is Future's self-titled album in 2017. The album was announced through social media on February 14th, and it was released 3 days later. 4 days after the album dropped, the song Draco was released as a single, but it didn't exactly top the charts. The song that would eventually top the charts and become one of the biggest songs of that year was Mask Off. How did fans know that this song was so catchy? Because they listened to the entire album and then ended up coming back to that song over and over again. The song wasn't initially forced onto them through some elaborate and overbearing marketing campaign. Future saw how well the song was being responded to and later decided to release it as a single on April 18th. In this instance, not only does the artist save a bunch of money on the pre-promotion budget, billboards, press runs, etc., it alleviates a lot of pressure off of the artist and the label. The more you invest, the more you expect. And with no expectation behind any particular single, the label is at ease to sit back and observe what the music will do for its fan base on its own merit. It's also a bit of leap of faith from the artist. They're not hyping up their new project. They just trust us to listen to it. They trust us to get the art that they're making. I thought it'd also be funny to mention one glaring example of a surprise album failing in spectacular fashion, and that's the 2014 album Songs of Innocence by the Irish alt-rock band U2. Just trying to describe this situation makes me laugh. They partnered with Apple to release their 13th studio album at no cost on the iTunes store to 500 million people. The album was automatically added to users' music libraries in iTunes. And for those with automatic downloads enabled, it prompted an unwarranted download of the album onto their electronic devices. Many users did not want the album, and after several months, they were frustrated that they could not delete it off of their music libraries. Eventually, Apple had to release an app whose specific purpose was to allow you to delete this album off of your iTunes. I guess U2 deserves credit for thinking ambitiously, but they really overestimated their popularity on this one. It's kind of like forcing music onto a captive audience. I mean, did I listen to the album? Yes. Did having it forced into my iTunes library really bother me? No. But do I remember even a single second of music from this album? No. It's no secret that immediate gratification is a highly sought after commodity of the internet, and the surprise album is not going anywhere. It's certainly nice to be able to get excited for an impending album release, but having something dropped out of the blue is always a pleasant surprise. This is just me, but sometimes it's a bit of a wrench in the equation when I suddenly have to drop everything and listen to the new Jeff Rosenstock album because it wasn't penned into my listening schedule because no one knew it existed yet. I'm just being a control freak though. Ultimately, I do really appreciate the surprise album as a new and creative way for artists to reach out to their fans. So we've already touched on movies based on albums, but now things are going to get spicy. Let's talk about visual albums. It's only the recent rise in technology that has enabled elaborate visual album productions to be created on tighter budgets, and has also enabled users to stream the videos directly. How do you differentiate a movie based on an album with a visual album? This is all very subjective, but for me, there's two key differentiators. The first being that the literal sound of the visuals are centered entirely around or almost centered entirely around the album's music. This mainly means I'm looking for very little dialogue. I want the story to be told completely through the visuals that I'm seeing and the audio that's taken from the album. I don't want any other forces pushing the story forward. The other key differentiator, and I suppose this one's a bit arbitrary, is the timing of the release. Are the visuals of the album and the music of the album being released at the same time? Or did the album come first and the movie is just more of an afterthought? I feel like releasing the two projects separately is a strong indicator that they don't need to be paired together. They can exist without each other, or more specifically, that the album can exist without the visuals. By my definition, The Wall by Pink Floyd comes pretty close. Even before the album was released, the band intended to make a movie out of it. So in that sense, you could call The Wall the first true visual album. I mean, there's no rules here. The phrase visual album merely didn't exist until the 2010s. Visual album also definitely sounds cooler than calling it a movie based on an album. Either way, I guess you can think of it as the spiritual and more impressive successor to the music video. I could have easily mentioned Daft Punk's 2003 movie Interstellar 5555 in the movies based on album section as well. Conceptualized during the recording sessions of their groundbreaking 2001 electronic house album Discovery, Daft Punk teamed up with their childhood hero Leiji Matsumoto to create a sci-fi anime film about an alien rock band that's captured by a music executive and forced to perform on Earth. A bit of a social commentary on the state of the music industry in general, if you will. The story is really easy to track through the visuals, although there's no dialogue and barely any sound effects. Since it's so close in history to the canonical birth of the visual album, most people tend to lump Interstellar 5555 in with the visual album crowd as opposed to the movies based on albums crowd. Either way, it's a fucking fantastic movie. I highly recommend it, and also RIP to the greatest electronic music act ever. The visualization of an entire album is a challenging undertaking. Even if you have a narrative in place already, what imagery is consistent with and aesthetically appropriate for the music? The visual album is a chance for musicians to prove their vision, explore their depths, connect with audiences, and assume full control of the work they put out there. Most people would cite Beyoncé's self-titled 2013 album as being the first true visual album, or at least she was the first person to promote her album using that phrase. It wasn't just a gimmick either, because she followed it up with an arguably even more ambitious project in 2016's Lemonade. Looking specifically at the self-titled album, Beyoncé first considered the idea of creating a visual album in June 2013, when only 3 or 4 of the songs had even been completed. Explaining her motivation, Beyoncé said she would often connect images, childhood memories, emotions, fantasies, all of the above, to the songs she was in the midst of composing, and that I
wanted people to hear the songs with the story that's in my head, because it's what makes it mine. That vision in my brain is what I wanted people to experience the first time.
The videos were filmed in between June and November 2013 as Beyoncé traveled on her world tour. When filming in public, Beyoncé would wear in-ear headphones to listen to the music as opposed to playing the music out loud, in order to keep the project a secret and to avoid any songs getting leaked. By the time of post-production, the songwriting process began to converge with the content of the visuals, and Beyoncé would actually watch unedited footage so that she could fit the music to it. The songs Flawless, Rocket, and Mine were noted to have been changed by their visual counterparts, with Todd Torso, the creative director, commenting that she would rewrite some lines, or she would add certain audio, or she would add bridges. And he believed that it would complete the picture of where the audio needed to go. I mean, this solidifies the album as a visual album. There are cases where the music is being dictated by the visuals on screen. This has not been true of any of the albums that I've mentioned so far. The closest thing to this would be situations where music had to be re-recorded to fit the needs of the visuals, but even in that case, you just end up having 2 different versions of the same song in 2 different places. Whereas on the album Beyoncé, the audio and the visuals are intertwined in a way that's never been done before. Although there's technically no traceable plot that's connecting all of the songs together, each song is strongly illustrated through its visuals. The visuals allow the listener to achieve a greater understanding of the music that they're listening to. In 2016, Beyoncé surprised us with another visual album, titled Lemonade. The album itself is a really powerful concept album that relates Beyoncé's emotional journey after her husband's infidelity in a generational and racial context. If anything, this concept lends itself more easily to a visual format, although that's not necessarily to say that it's any easier of an endeavor. The film was directed by a host of filmmakers, including Beyoncé herself, and then shaped by Beyoncé and her collaborators into a series of experimental vignettes and recurring motifs. Allow me to also take a moment to highlight Frank Ocean's 2016 visual album effort, Endless. Frank Ocean, of course, being an alternative R&B and neo-soul superstar in his own right. Also, as a footnote, while the film Endless was initially debuted and available for streaming in 2016, it was later remastered and had a limited reissue in physical audio and video formats in 2018. Endless is a 45-minute black and white feature with no discernible narrative, depicting a digitally multiplied Frank Ocean, slowly, and I mean slowly, assembling from scratch a staircase that leads to nowhere in the middle of a warehouse. The music on the album is often equally as inscrutable as the visuals. If you're looking for a second helping of Nostalgia Ultra or Channel Orange, you really won't find that here. The sound of the album is very spacious, ambient, even robotic in some instances. I could entertain the theory that Endless is actually a sister album to the other album that Frank Ocean dropped in 2016, Blonde. Both albums take a similar minimalistic approach to beats and songwriting, although Blonde offers way more in the way of mainstream appeal, whereas Endless honestly offers very little of that. Even the ending of the film isn't satisfying in the usual sense, as it abruptly cuts out before Frank even reaches the top of his own staircase. It's a work of experimental cinema, but with banner advertising and major fanfare from Apple Music, all for an eager audience clamoring for new music from Frank Ocean since 2012. It's a sign of savvy and confidence on Frank Ocean's part to release this film. He's taken the leverage that he has as a popular artist to foist onto an unsuspecting public a very radical display of performance art and filmmaking. For 45 minutes late on a Thursday night, audiences around the world sat enraptured by something that most of them would not be caught dead paying for at a movie theater if they knew what the project truly entailed. They did watch it though, and tweet about it, and analyze it, and break it down, and within a few hours of it being posted, every song accompanying the film had already been dissected over on Genius. Endless is an experimental movie, and even its rollout was an experiment, delivered to the mainstream inside the Trojan horse of new Frank Ocean music. Realistically, visual albums are not the norm. They're huge undertakings, wildly expensive, and their success banks highly on the popularity of the artist. I mean, up-and-coming indie artists already have to worry about getting people to listen to their album at all. Getting someone to listen to your album and sit down and watch your album on a big screen is a pretty steep demand when the collective attention span of music listeners is essentially at an all-time low. I don't anticipate visual albums becoming some huge overarching trend in the near future, but I could be wrong. I'm just happy that artists are finding new ways to push the envelope by adding new layers of expression and interactivity to the album experiences that they craft. The very last dedicated topic that I want to address in this project is integrally linked to the process of releasing your music digitally. We're all humans, we all make mistakes. Releasing music is no exception to this rule. Sometimes you release your album and the mixing on it is kind of shoddy, or maybe the track listing gets printed incorrectly, or maybe even your blue album cover gets printed green for whatever reason. And some people buy it and end up having an unintended collector's edition of your album. In the past, with physical releases, what's done is done. There's no way to fix or edit a product once it's already in the hands of a customer. But nowadays, with music streaming, most of the albums that you listen to you probably don't physically own. Instead, they exist in the cloud on the streaming platforms that you use. And thus, the possibility exists for artists to change pieces of work that they've already released to the public. What kind of changes, you ask? Well, it's really at the artist's discretion. All of the mistakes I just listed could easily be remedied via digital music releases. An artist can update the mixing on an album or change the album artwork at any time. They could even change a song in a drastic way by adding additional music to it. An example of this can be found on the 2019 album by trap rapper Young Thug, So Much Fun. The third track on that album, Ecstasy, was actually updated after the initial release of the album to include an additional guest verse by rapper Machine Gun Kelly. This is a pretty noticeable change to a song that could definitely affect someone's enjoyment of it in a conflicting way. You might feel that the additional verse was unnecessary and that the original song was fine as is. I've seen people liken this idea of patching an album after its release to the video game culture that exists today. These days, when a video game gets released, its developers don't just stop looking at it and move on to something else. They monitor the state of the game, they intake user feedback, and they might roll out patches to remove any bugs or glitches that they might have originally missed. They could change the gameplay itself by, adjusting how the environment interacts with the player or how certain mechanics work, or they could add additional features to the game or content. Because the mediums are just so different, it certainly feels a little weird to compare the patching of video games to the patching of music on a music streaming platform. But I think the comparison is worthwhile and does make sense. There's a very notorious and gigantically memed example of fixing a song post-release in the form of the 2018 trap rap song by Travis Scott titled Yosemite. The song features an outro verse by Canadian rapper Nav, and for whatever reason, the mixing on Nav's vocals were really low, like egregiously low. Like, just listen to this.
The flame on the island, me and Couch gonna hop on a Learjet. Got potters every color, and I got CCs you ain't seen yet.
It's so low that you can barely hear what he's saying over the bass. This prompted the internet, as they do, to meme the ever-living shit out of Nav. The track's mix was adjusted a week later, but doesn't it make you wonder, how seriously are artists taking their music releases these days? If it's so easy and casual to fix a mistake like this on your album, then do you even have a quality assurance process at all? I mean, shouldn't you want to release the best possible version of your music to your fans right from the get-go? Also, what's to stop artists from retroactively changing their music whenever they want? What if there's an album that you really like but haven't listened to in a while? You go back to it and listen to it, and you find that some songs have been altered in a way that makes you enjoy them less. Does that cheapen your overall experience with an album to know that it was an album you previously liked, but now a newer, different version of it exists that you don't like as much? You'd have to go fishing online to find the older version of the album that you like. Is that even worth the effort? I'm being pretty negative here because I do honestly believe that the practice of changing your music after you've already released it, especially in the hands of, say, greedy record labels, opens the door to a lot of negative possibilities. However, in the right hands, it opens the door to a lot of positive and really creative possibilities. Let's look to Kanye West's 2016 album, The Life of Pablo. After the initial release of the album on February 14th, Kanye in a tweet described the album as a living, breathing, changing, creative expression. And he stated his intentions to continue adjusting the mixes of several tracks among many other changes. As far as I know, this is the only instance of a project like this ever happening. It's definitely never been attempted by an artist with as much influence as Kanye West. Let's look at the changes as they were rolled out. On March 13th, a month after the album's release, Kanye uploaded an updated version of the song Famous, swapping out some of the lyrics and tweaking the overall mix. 3 days later, Kanye updated the track listing with a reworked version of the song Wolves, which now included previously removed guest verses by Vic Mensa and Sia. He also separated the ending of the song, which was sung by Frank Ocean, into its own separate track with the title Frank's Track. On March 30th, The Life of Pablo received a major update with at least 12 songs appearing in altered forms. Updates included prominent vocal additions, new lyrics, reworked mixes. Def Jam, the record label that distributed the album, confirmed this incarnation to be a newly updated, remixed, and remastered version. Finally, on June 14th, The Life of Pablo was updated to include a new ending track titled St. Pablo, featuring guest vocals from British singer Sampha, along with some other miscellaneous updates. This was honestly a really exciting and absolutely unprecedented way to enjoy the album. It, of course, gave the album a whole lot of replay value. You'd hear that a new version or new updates to the album had been pushed out, and you'd go back and re-listen to the whole thing to see if you could spot the changes. I distinctly remember listening to the song FML, which features The Weeknd, and during his part, there were actually some backing vocals that had been added.
Wish I would go ahead and fuck my life up. Can't let them get to me. And even though I always fuck my life up, only I can mention it.
There's also the song Feedback, the most spastic song on the album. Its production was completely revamped, and I would say for the better.
Hey, y'all heard about the good news? Y'all sleeping on me, huh? Had a good snooze. Wake up, nigga, wake up. Hey, y'all heard about the good news? Y'all sleeping on me, huh? Had a good snooze. Wake up, nigga, wake up.
As opposed to the Nav and Travis Scott situation, I would say that this rendition of editing your album post-release is a much more true artistic endeavor. Kanye is not just fixing a glaring mistake that never should have been made. He's breathing new life into his work. Now, while I personally enjoy a lot of the changes that were made, and I really enjoyed listening to the album transform, it's very likely that somebody else did not enjoy these changes as much. There's probably even listeners out there that prefer the very original version of the album and feel that Kanye tainted it with his changes. Still though, even if we compare this to the Young Thug situation, I feel that Kanye's intentions are a lot more original and creative. Definitely more so than just throwing on a random additional verse from a guest artist to pack on some extra clout. And to stick with the video game comparison, you could think of Kanye adding the song St. Pablo to his album as a video game getting DLC. downloadable content that was not a part of the original release. For me, St. Pablo is a fantastic track. I think it's beautiful, it's super satisfying. I love the sample feature. I love that it ends the album. The song itself adds a new layer of appreciation that I have for the album that wasn't there before. The Life of Pablo came out 5 years ago at this point. 5 years is a pretty long time in the music industry, but since this album, we haven't seen anyone attempt an undertaking anywhere near this level yet. At the same time, though, it definitely makes sense for a celebrity of Kanye West's stature to attempt something like this versus just some random indie band. Anything even remotely contrarian Kanye does generates a metric fuck ton of media buzz, whereas nobody would give a shit if a random band in Brooklyn edited their album that they put on Bandcamp. I guess so far no one has had the time or interest to continue creatively rewriting an album after it's already finished. Still though, I really appreciate Kanye's idea and execution here. And the idea of art never truly being finished has been proposed in the past. In a biography published in 1948, Pablo Picasso is quoted talking about the nature of artwork being considered finished. Have you ever seen a finished picture, he asked. A picture or anything else? Woe unto the day it is said you are finished. To finish a work, to finish a picture, what nonsense. To finish it means to be through with it, to kill it, to rid it of its soul, to give it its final blow, the most unfortunate one for the painter as well as for the picture. So I guess we know who the album is named after. What a slog. If you've managed to make it this far into the lecture, truly, thank you for putting up with me this entire time. At this point, I feel like I've discussed everything there can be to discuss about the album, except for maybe the live album. I just had no idea really where to throw that in. I mean, most of the time, it's just the artist playing music that you already know with crowd noises added. There's certainly instances of artists getting a little improvisational, but usually nothing earth-shattering. Unless we're talking about Alive 2007. That's the greatest live album of all time. Also, Homecoming by Beyonce is pretty cool. Also, Band of Gypsies is pretty cool. But all tangents aside, I think I've discussed every evolution undergone by the album, and I have honed in on the fact that there's been a lot of discussion around the album's impending doom. So I ask, is the album dead or dying? Well, take what I have to say with a grain of salt. I'm a music nerd. I surround myself with music nerds, and I don't think the album's dead. I know that people are out there. My friends, the weirdos that I see trawling Rate Your Music and Album of the Year, and we're hungry for albums. We want artists to blow us away with impactful and fulfilling expressions. And as far as I know, the album is still the best way to do that. And that's all just my opinion and personal experience. But I do know one objective fact. It is currently May 2021, and if you so much as whisper the name Kendrick Lamar, then the entire fucking music scene is going to be down your throat, and they're not going to be asking you, oh, when's the next Kendrick Lamar single coming out? When's the next Kendrick Lamar EP coming out? When's the next Kendrick Lamar mixtape coming out? They're going to be bombarding you with the same singular question. When is the next Kendrick Lamar album coming out? That's what the people want. That's everything I have to say. Albums are awesome. Thank you for listening to me ramble. I hope you listen to some albums that you like, maybe discover a new album that you will like in the future, and I hope you have a good day or night and stay safe. Bye, I guess.